The morning I received my deployment orders was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that makes you reflect on everything you've built and everything you're about to leave behind. I stood in the kitchen of my modest two-story home, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug, staring at the sunrise bleeding over the ridge beyond my quiet suburban street. My name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway, United States Air Force, and I was being deployed overseas for an 8-month classified mission. Before I left, I took every precaution. I filed proper leave notices, locked up all personal belongings, and turned over a spare key to my trusted neighbor, Joe, a retired Navy vet who agreed to check in on the house every week. I even notified the local HOA office, informing them formally that I would be away and requested no alterations, maintenance, or access to my property unless an emergency occurred. I had lived here for 5 years without a single issue, paid my dues on time, and kept my lawn tidy, so I didn't expect any trouble. I deployed with a calm mind, focused on my mission. I served honorably, completed my tasks, and sent the occasional email to Joe, asking if everything was quiet on the home front. His replies were always short. All good, house is safe. So I had no reason to worry. That changed the moment I returned. I landed stateside late in the evening and didn't tell anyone I was coming home early. I wanted to surprise my mother the next day and maybe get some uninterrupted rest in my own bed. When my Uber pulled into my neighborhood, I felt something was off. My house, lit from within, had a car parked in the driveway. Not my car, a white Lexus sedan. I frowned. Maybe Joe. But Joe didn't drive a Lexus. He had a beat-up blue Ford Ranger. I got out, bags in hand, and walked up to my front porch, confused but trying not to jump to conclusions. As I reached for the door, I noticed the porch lights had been changed, replaced with sleek, modern ones I'd never installed. Even the welcome mat was new. My heart pounded harder as I inserted my key. It didn't fit, not jammed, not rusted, completely changed. I stood there in disbelief, rattling the key like it would magically work. Finally, I rang the doorbell. A woman answered, blonde, mid-30s, robe on, clearly annoyed. "Can I help you?" she asked, arms crossed. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "This is my house." She blinked. "No, I think you're mistaken. We just signed a 6-month lease." I was stunned. "You what?" Behind her, a man appeared, shirtless and holding a remote. "Is this guy bothering you?" "Listen," I said, trying to remain calm. "I own this house. I've lived here for years. I was deployed overseas. I just got back. This has to be a mistake." The man laughed. "Maybe you have the wrong address, dude." I pulled out my military ID. "This is my address, my orders, my documents. I've got everything." They didn't care. "Call the landlord," the woman said, starting to close the door. "I am the landlord," I yelled, stepping forward. The door slammed. I stood there in disbelief. My keys didn't work. Strangers were in my home. I walked to Joe's place, but the house was dark. No one home. I paced the street for an hour, heart racing with anger and confusion. Eventually, I called the police, only to be told it was a civil matter and that if tenants had a lease, the issue would have to go through legal channels. They couldn't force the occupants out based on my word alone. At 2 a.m., I slept in the back seat of my rental car, parked in front of my own house like a trespasser. The next morning, I went to the HOA office. It was worse than I thought. Their receptionist greeted me casually until I explained who I was. Her eyes widened. "You're Sergeant Calloway?" she asked, then disappeared into the back office. 5 minutes later, a smug man in a gray suit came out. "Peter Langston, HOA Board President." "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I assure you, this is all above board. Since you were overseas and the property was unoccupied for more than 90 days, per our bylaws, the HOA had the authority to temporarily lease it out. You what? He smiled. It's for the upkeep of the neighborhood. Vacant properties can drive down value. You leased my house while I was serving my country? His face didn't flinch. You should have read the fine print. I stared at him in disbelief. This wasn't a bad dream. But I had one more call to make. I pulled out my phone and called my base commander. Because they picked the wrong house and the wrong soldier, and in less than 24 hours, they were going to learn what that meant. After the call to my base commander, things started moving. Fast. Colonel Hastings wasn't just my superior. He was someone who understood what it meant to serve and sacrifice. When I told him what the HOA had done, renting out my personal home while I was deployed, his calm voice went cold. They did what? I gave him the full rundown. The changed locks, the fake lease, the strangers living in my house, and the smug HOA president who claimed it was all within their rights. Colonel Hastings didn't waste a second. Stay put. I'll activate JAG. We'll handle this the military way. Meanwhile, I wasn't just going to sit and wait. I drove to the county records office, hoping to find out if any title transfers or rental agreements had been recorded. The clerk, a kind older woman named Susan, raised an eyebrow when she pulled up the address. Huh, that's odd. What is? I asked. There's a temporary lease filed just 3 weeks ago by the HOA board, not the property owner. My jaw clenched. Can I get a copy of that? You bet. The lease showed that the HOA had created a short-term emergency occupancy lease and listed themselves as the property managers. They had rented my house to a couple, Chad and Kimberly Mercer, for $2,800 a month. Utilities included. I felt sick. That was more than double my mortgage. They were making thousands off my home, while I slept in tents overseas and ate reheated rations in war zones. My pictures, my grandmother's china cabinet, the flag from my father's casket. Those were likely boxed up or thrown out. I felt violated. I thanked Susan and left with copies of the paperwork. As I sat in my car, I called Joe again. This time, he answered. Joe, it's Marcus. Marcus, you're back? Man, I was wondering why the HOA told me to stop checking your place. They what? Yeah. A few months ago, some guy from the HOA told me they'd be handling the property. Said you signed something. I told them I hadn't heard from you, but they said you sent power of attorney. I never did. Marcus, I'm so sorry. If I'd known. It's not your fault, Joe. I'll fix this. I hung up, seething. Back at the house, I stayed in my car while watching the tenants through the front window. They were living comfortably. Big screen TV, my old couch, new decorations. My personal paintings were gone. The American flag I kept in the corner. Not in sight. It looked like a different home. My home had been gutted and turned into a rental property for profit. I couldn't even imagine what they did with my personal items. As I sat there, a black SUV pulled up behind me. Out stepped Major Sarah Linwood, JAG Corps. You Marcus Calloway? She asked, flashing her credentials. Yes, ma'am. Let's get your house back. She went over the paperwork I'd collected and nodded grimly. They exploited a loophole in the HOA charter, one that doesn't apply to federally deployed service members under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. They're in deep trouble. That's when she dropped the hammer. We're issuing a cease and desist notice to the HOA. We've filed an emergency injunction, and your base commander has authorized a full legal response on your behalf under military protection. In less than 2 hours, we returned to the HOA office. This time, I didn't go alone. Colonel Hastings himself walked in beside me in full uniform. The smug receptionist froze. Langston, the HOA president, came out from his office smiling until he saw the eagle insignia on Hastings's chest. "Mr. Langston," Hastings said with military precision, "you have 24 hours to vacate the property you illegally leased and to return all of Staff Sergeant Calloway's belongings in the condition they were left. Failure to do so will result in federal charges for violation of military protection laws, including unlawful seizure of property and fraudulent leasing practices." Langston's face went white. "You can't just—" "I can and I will," Hastings snapped. "You're dealing with federal law now, not your neighborhood HOA rulebook." Major Linwood placed a thick envelope on the desk. "You've been served. See you in court." Langston stammered. "It was in the bylaws." "No," I cut in. "It was in your greed, and you're going to pay for it." That night I slept in a hotel, on base, covered by a military emergency fund. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. Tomorrow the tenants would be gone. My house would be mine again. But I wasn't done. I didn't just want my home back. I wanted accountability and justice. By sunrise the next day, I was outside my house again, this time with a different energy pulsing through my veins. Justice had been set in motion, and I was ready to reclaim what was mine. The base legal team had filed the emergency court orders overnight, and I had copies of every document in hand. But what I didn't expect that morning was just how deep this rabbit hole of HOA corruption truly went. The white Lexus was still parked in the driveway, curtains drawn, the couple inside apparently still unaware of the legal tidal wave heading their way. Major Linwood arrived just after 8 a.m. with a civilian process server and a local sheriff deputy in tow, part of the coordinated response arranged through my base commander. They approached the door while I watched from the sidewalk, my fists clenched in my pockets. Knock, knock. The same blonde woman, Kimberly Mercer, opened the door wearing gym clothes and holding a smoothie. Her smug smile faded as soon as she saw the uniformed deputy and the JAG attorney. "Ma'am," said the deputy, "you're being formally served with a notice to vacate the property within 12 hours. This home was leased to you under fraudulent authority by the HOA, and you are now in unlawful possession." She blinked. "What?" "No, this is our home. We have a lease." "Yes, a fraudulent one," Linwood said firmly. "The homeowner, Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway, never consented to the lease. He was deployed overseas under military orders. That makes this lease illegal under federal law." From inside the house, her husband appeared again, looking disheveled and confused. "Are you serious? The HOA said this house was theirs to manage." "That's incorrect," the deputy replied. "You were misled. You have 12 hours to vacate." "I want a lawyer," Kimberly snapped. "You'll need one," I muttered under my breath. While the Mercers scrambled to make calls and throw clothes into suitcases, I stood by the curb with Major Linwood. "They're not the only tenants," she said, flipping through a manila folder. "What?" She turned the folder toward me. "Turns out the HOA's been doing this with multiple properties. 3 other homes in the neighborhood were leased the same way. Owners away on long-term travel, some on military duty, others dealing with family emergencies." My stomach dropped. "You're telling me this wasn't a one-off?" "Number. It was a side business," she said. "Langston and 2 other board members have been exploiting vacant homes, leasing them out under a shell management company called Clearwater Residential Solutions. They collect rent, pocket most of it, and file minimal maintenance receipts to the HOA's internal books." Unbelievable. They picked targets they assumed wouldn't fight back, people gone for months, people like you. My blood boiled. They thought I was an easy target. She nodded. "They didn't know you had a commander who doesn't play games, and a law team that actually reads the law. By noon, the Mercers were loading the last of their belongings into the Lexus. Chad approached me, surprisingly calm. "Look, man, I didn't know, I swear. We were looking for a short-term lease, and the HOA handled everything." "I get it," I said, biting back anger. "But that was my home. You lived in it while I was overseas, fighting for the country that protects people from stuff like this." He nodded, ashamed. "They said you abandoned it." My jaw tightened. "I was deployed." He left without another word. With the house finally empty, I stepped inside for the first time in over 8 months. It felt like walking into a stranger's Airbnb. My furniture had been rearranged. The walls were painted beige instead of the light gray I loved. My military awards and framed family photos were missing from the walls. My father's folded flag had been shoved into a storage bin in the garage, dust-covered, dishonored. But worst of all, my grandmother's hand-stitched quilt, the one that had hung over the banister since the day I bought the house, was gone. I sank onto the couch. My couch. Everything smelled wrong. "I'll help you document damages," said Linwood gently, pulling out her phone. "We'll add this to the civil claim." "You think Langston will try to fight it?" I asked. "He might, but we've already subpoenaed his financials, and Clearwater Residential Solutions, registered under his sister's name. We're already preparing federal fraud charges." She stepped outside to make a call, and I stayed behind, slowly walking from room to room, filming everything. Broken drawer handles, missing decor, scratches on the hardwood floor. Cheap rugs covering what I suspected were even worse problems underneath. But I was back, and they weren't, and this was only the beginning. The HOA had built their empire on other people's homes, assuming no one would ever return to challenge them. Well, I was home, and I was bringing it all down. By the end of that day, I had walked through every inch of my home. Every room had been touched, altered, or stripped of something personal. My bookshelf was replaced with a minimalist IKEA piece filled with travel magazines. My medals, photos, and memorabilia gone. My grandmother's quilt, the only thing I had left of her, still missing. Major Linwood met me that evening to go over documentation for the civil lawsuit. She handed me a list of recovered items that were found boxed in the HOA's storage facility, a glorified shed behind their office building. Some of my belongings were found there, including the photos and the awards, but not the quilt. "We'll press for full compensation for anything missing," she said, "but we may find out some items were sold, which crosses into criminal theft." "They had no right to touch any of it," I said bitterly. "None of it was theirs." Linwood nodded. "Exactly why this case is so serious. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, a deployed soldier's property is protected. No lease can be made, no sale, no transfer, unless you personally authorize it. You didn't. They forged or misrepresented authority." The next morning, I met with the HOA board at an emergency assembly meeting, one the court ordered after we filed a temporary restraining order against the organization. It was held in the local rec center, and word had spread fast. Half the neighborhood showed up. I wore my uniform, not for intimidation, but as a reminder of who they'd violated. Peter Langston stood stiffly at the front of the room. 2 other board members, Donna Reed and Greg Matthews, sat beside him, red-faced and tight-lipped. They looked more like cornered criminals than community leaders. Major Linwood addressed the crowd first. "This meeting is now under court oversight," she began. "It concerns violations committed by members of this HOA against Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway during his federally ordered deployment. Specifically, unauthorized leasing, fraudulent contracts, financial misconduct, and violation of federal protections granted to active duty military members." Murmurs erupted through the crowd. I spotted Joe in the third row, arms crossed, giving Langston the kind of stare that could shatter glass. Langston tried to speak. We acted under the bylaws. No, Linwood cut in. You exploited a misinterpretation of the bylaws. Not only did you fail to obtain written permission from the homeowner, but you also willfully leased the property under a false management company you helped create. That's fraud. Greg Matthews tried to deflect. We only did it to help the community. Empty homes attract crime. Spare us, I said, stepping forward. You weren't protecting anyone. You were padding your wallets. Langston's jaw tensed. You can't prove I made a dime off any of this. Linwood calmly opened a folder. Actually, we can. Your name appears in 4 bank transfers from Clearwater Residential Solutions, totaling over $18,000 in the last 4 months. And we subpoenaed the company records yesterday. Guess what? The lease to Sergeant Calloway's home was signed by your cousin, posing as the managing agent. Langston looked like he'd swallowed glass. The crowd gasped. Some of the HOA members began whispering angrily. Joe stood up. This is what you were doing while the rest of us were mowing lawns and fixing fences, renting out homes of deployed soldiers. Another neighbor added, My cousin's house down the street is empty. She's been in hospice care for months. Did you lease her place too? Langston tried to walk out, but the deputy guarding the door stopped him. You're not going anywhere, Major Linwood continued. The court will now freeze all HOA discretionary funds. An independent audit will begin immediately, and pending charges are being filed for conspiracy to commit fraud, abuse of position, and violation of federal protections. Additionally, a full reimbursement and damages package will be requested by the plaintiff, Staff Sergeant Calloway. Langston sat down heavily. The meeting ended in chaos, neighbors arguing, former allies turning their backs on the board, and whispers of a full recall election echoing across the room. Back at my house, I finally allowed myself to breathe. A locksmith came by, arranged by the base, and changed every lock on the doors, the garage, even the shed. I walked through the house again, slowly beginning the process of restoring what had been stolen. Not just furniture and keepsakes, but a sense of peace. Later that night, I got a text from Joe. Checked the HOA storage again. Found something wrapped in plastic. Quilt looks like it's yours. I drove over in a heartbeat. He met me outside the storage unit and handed over a tightly sealed garbage bag. Inside, my grandmother's quilt was intact, musty, wrinkled, but safe. I held it to my chest and nearly lost it right there. They didn't win, Joe said quietly. Not this time. No, they didn't. They had no permission, no rights. And now, they had no power. The morning after the HOA board's dramatic unraveling, I stood on my front porch wrapped in my grandmother's quilt. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm glow on the neighborhood that, just days ago, had turned its back on me. Today it felt different, calmer, like I was finally standing on ground that was once again my own. But there was still one thing on my mind. Justice wasn't fully served yet. Major Linwood had assured me the civil lawsuit was solid and that criminal charges were forthcoming. But the deeper I thought about what Langston and his crew had done, not just to me but to others who couldn't defend themselves, the more I realized something bigger had to happen. This wasn't about personal revenge anymore. It was about making sure this never happened to another soldier, widow, or elderly homeowner again. And for that, I needed help from someone higher up. I grabbed my phone, scrolled to a secure contact number I hadn't used in months, and hit dial. Colonel Hastings speaking, came the voice on the other end. Sir, I said, it's Staff Sergeant Calloway. I've got an idea, but I'm going to need some backup. Go on. I laid it out. A coordinated operation, one that didn't just tackle Langston's scheme but exposed the HOA's entire network of shady rentals, misused funds, and cover-ups. I wanted a task force, legal, military, and investigative, to audit every transaction Langston had pushed through in the past year. If there were other victims, we'd find them. If other HOAs were using similar schemes, we'd catch them. There was a pause on the line. Then Hastings replied, "You're thinking bigger than I expected, Sergeant. And I like it. I'll make the call to JAGHQ. We'll loop in CID. CID, the Criminal Investigation Division. Things were about to get serious. By noon, a temporary command post had been established in the back meeting room of our local VFW hall. Hastings, Linwood, a CID investigator named Agent Morales, and two military legal techs met to go over everything we had. I provided all my documents, recordings from the HOA meeting, digital leases, bank transactions, and Joe's witness statement. Morales was a quiet man, mid-40s, and looked like he'd seen the underside of society more than once. He read over the Clearwater Residential Solutions lease and narrowed his eyes. "They forged your signature," he said flatly. "What?" I asked, leaning in. He turned the document around. "See this? The Callaway signature here. It was copy-pasted from your original mortgage document. Look closely. Identical curves, same pixel density. Someone scanned your signature and dragged it into this file." I was stunned. "So it's not just fraud, it's forgery." "Felony forgery," Morales confirmed. "That changes everything." With new evidence, Linwood immediately requested a federal warrant for Langston's arrest. Meanwhile, CID started digging through HOA emails, several of which had been sent through an unsecured server. Within hours, they discovered internal conversations about how to quietly reallocate unused homes and create short-term leases through friendly family entities. It wasn't just criminal, it was organized. And they'd left a digital trail that was damning. That evening, Hastings and I walked the perimeter of my property, watching the lights flicker back on one by one. The locks were changed. The camera system had been upgraded by base security. A military-grade perimeter sensor was now installed, not to protect against attackers, but to ensure peace of mind. "You really stirred the hornet's nest, Sergeant," Hastings said with a grin. "I didn't mean to," I replied, "but I'm glad I did." "Sometimes," he said, "one soldier's fight sets off a chain reaction that saves others. This might be one of those times." That night, I radioed back to my old deployment unit, my way of staying in touch. It was a brief call, but I shared what happened and what was still coming. "Sir," my former squad mate Torres said, "you took on your HOA like it was a hostile outpost, and you won." We laughed, but deep down I knew the mission wasn't over. Langston and his cronies were just the tip of something far more widespread. And now the military had eyes on it. From one radio call, a plan had formed. From one forged lease, a network had unraveled. And from one returning soldier, a whole system was about to fall. 2 days after the command post was established, the small town of Fair Hollow was buzzing in a way it never had before. Military personnel in uniform could be spotted speaking with residents. CID agents moved through HOA offices with sealed boxes and warrants, and whispers of federal investigation passed from porch to porch like wildfire. To the average civilian, it looked like overkill. To me, it was long overdue. Langston and his fellow board members had operated with smug confidence for years. Their word had been law within the gates of our neighborhood. Until now, no one dared question the HOA's decisions. If someone pushed back too hard, the board would cite obscure bylaws or issue fines until the resident gave up. But this wasn't a fine, this was federal scrutiny. It started early that morning when two black sedans pulled into the HOA administrative office's lot. I was across the street with Major Linwood and Agent Morales. We watched as CID agents stepped out, handed a copy of the federal warrant to the receptionist, and calmly walked through the glass doors. Inside, the staff scrambled. One woman tried to sneak a flash drive into her purse, but was stopped immediately. Morales chuckled. Amateurs. Within 20 minutes, CID had locked down the entire building. Computers, hard drives, documents, and even the petty cash safe were all confiscated. The receptionist, clearly not part of the scheme, was sent home in tears. Langston, however, was nowhere to be found. Looks like he skipped town, Linwood said, scanning her tablet. We issued a bench warrant an hour ago. He knows he's done. Greg Matthews and Donna Reed, the two other board members, were both placed under immediate questioning. Matthews cracked first. He admitted they had borrowed the leasing idea from another HOA in a neighboring county. Apparently, there was an informal network of HOA boards exchanging strategies to monetize inactive homes, especially ones owned by service members, foreign workers, or elderly residents in nursing homes. It was bigger than we thought. Hastings called an emergency meeting with the base legal team and CID. I attended, seated at the long steel table in the back room of the VFW. Agent Morales laid out the map. 5 HOAs in surrounding towns had similar patterns: mysterious leases, forged permissions, family-run shell management companies, all benefiting the same types of board members. This isn't just greed, Morales said. It's systemic corruption operating under the cover of community management. I spoke up. And how many of those inactive homes belong to people like me? People serving their country overseas? We're still calculating that, Linwood replied, but we've already found 6 in this county alone. Colonel Hastings stood at the head of the room, hands behind his back. This is now a priority investigation. We'll coordinate with DOJ, military legal affairs, and state authorities to pursue every HOA involved. I nodded, but part of me was still raging inside. For every house they rented, how many families were robbed of security? How many veterans returned to find their homes stripped and stolen by paperwork tricks and manipulated bylaws? That evening, as I returned to my home, I saw something on the door. A small handwritten note from a neighbor, Mrs. Alder. Thank you for standing up. My son's in the Navy and his house is next door. The HOA said they'd take care of it last month. I was scared to say anything, but now I'm not scared anymore. It was signed simply, gratefully, Eleanor Alder. That hit harder than any courtroom victory. This wasn't about me anymore. It had become a movement. Military protocol was like a scalpel, precise, professional, and backed by law. Civilian corruption had operated like a shadow, slimy and hidden beneath layers of red tape and fear. But now the light was pouring in. People were speaking out, families were coming forward, and every lease, every unauthorized tenant, every forged document was being exposed. The next day, Langston was caught at a motel outside the state line, trying to withdraw money from a Clearwater Residential Solutions account. His arrest was quiet, but the fallout was loud. The news hit local TV. Words like racketeering, exploitation, and military fraud flashed across headlines. At a town hall meeting called 2 days later, hundreds of residents showed up. Hastings gave a short, firm speech. Linwood laid out the legal process. And I stood at the podium last, looking out at my neighbors, many of whom had once looked the other way when the HOA's behavior was questioned. I stood watch overseas, I said, voice steady. I served this country so people like all of us could live in peace, but I never expected to come home and be robbed, legally, by the people meant to protect our community. The HOA didn't just violate laws, they violated trust. And now it's time to rebuild that trust with accountability. The room stood in silence. Then one person clapped, then another. Soon it was thunderous. Because military protocol had met civilian corruption, and for once the uniform won. The moment Langston was cuffed and walked out of that dusty roadside motel by federal agents, a silent but powerful shift rippled through Fair Hollow. What was once an untouchable HOA regime had officially crumbled, and now came the next phase, rebuilding, or as Colonel Hastings bluntly called it, Operation Reclaim Home. While the military and federal teams focused on the legal carnage, I was granted full custodial authority to restore and secure my property. But I wasn't the only one. Other victims, like Mrs. Alder's son and a deployed Coast Guard officer named Raymond Salas, were now surfacing, sharing eerily similar stories. Changed locks, missing heirlooms, unauthorized renovations, and strangers living in their homes. And somehow every single lease pointed back to Clearwater Residential Solutions. Morales and Linwood went to work filing new charges: identity theft, forgery, money laundering, conspiracy. By now, Langston and his network were facing decades in prison. But while the legal machine churned, I had a different kind of operation to lead. Step 1. Restore the house. Joe and I spent the next 2 days moving furniture back into place, scrubbing down surfaces, and unpacking what few of my belongings remained. The Mercers, the tenants who'd lived there, had actually treated the place with moderate care. But it wasn't the physical mess that haunted me. It was the emotional one. The idea that someone else lived in my space, touched my memories, rearranged my life like it was a rental property. Step 2. Personal inventory. I made a list of everything missing. My father's antique pocket watch, 2 of my deployment coins, a signed photo from my first unit in Kandahar. The damage wasn't just financial, it was intimate. Linwood added it all to the restitution request. With the military's backing, the Department of Justice approved emergency compensation through the Military Housing Protection Act. It wouldn't bring back the originals, but it would help. Step 3. Neighborhood restoration. With the board dissolved and an interim civilian oversight committee installed, Fair Hollow held its first true public HOA election in years. I wasn't interested in joining, but Joe insisted I attend. "You stood up for all of us, Marcus," he said. "Now help make sure this never happens again." So I stood before my neighbors once more, not in uniform this time, but in jeans and a flannel shirt, a regular homeowner like them. "I don't want power," I said. "I just want fairness, transparency. The next board shouldn't operate in secret. You should never be afraid of the people managing your community. They should work for you, not over you." That speech echoed. People I hadn't spoken to in years came up, shook my hand, and apologized, not just for what happened, but for not seeing it sooner. By week's end, the interim HOA committee announced a full audit of all past fees, penalties, and fines levied over the last 3 years. Residents who had been unjustly fined or harassed were refunded or reimbursed. The books Langston once kept locked were now open and full of rot. Step 4. The final sweep. Hastings called me in on a Saturday morning. He and Morales had reviewed all the digital leases. Turns out Clearwater had attempted to secure one last long-term rental of my home, even after I'd returned. They had quietly filed paperwork claiming I was absent due to reassignment and tried to sell the lease to a relocation agency. It was their last desperate cash grab. "They were going to sell access to your house while you were already back in it," Morales said, disgusted. "They really thought I wouldn't notice?" I asked. "They counted on you being too late or too tired to fight." But I wasn't. That final document became the keystone of the federal indictment. It proved intent, malice, and ongoing fraud, enough to move the case from local jurisdiction to a federal racketeering charge under RICO statutes. Langston's empire, gone. His house, seized. Clearwater's bank accounts, frozen. And Fair Hollow, finally free. I sat on my restored porch that evening, the sun setting low across the rooftops. The street was quiet again, but not silent. Kids rode bikes, someone grilled steaks nearby, and Joe waved from his driveway, beer in hand. "Mission accomplished," he called out. I nodded. Operation Reclaim Home, complete. But more than that, a message had been sent to every crooked HOA president, every fake management firm, and every corrupt board hiding behind red tape. We're watching now, and we won't let it happen again. The call came just after 7 a.m. Colonel Hastings, his voice crisp and urgent, wasted no time. Langston has 24 hours to comply with the federal order. If he refuses, we're moving forward with full asset seizure and criminal transfer to federal court. I was sitting at my kitchen table, freshly brewed coffee in one hand, staring at the paperwork I'd nearly memorized by now. Affidavits, leases, damage reports, and restitution forms. After weeks of chaos, the air finally felt clearer, but Hastings' words reminded me we were still in the final sprint. Langston had been arrested, yes, but he had refused to give up the locations of 2 digital servers tied to Clearwater Residential Solutions, the very servers that stored forged leases, financial kickbacks, and private communications implicating not only him, but several members of HOAs in 2 neighboring counties. That data was the smoking gun we needed to shut this entire operation down. And he was hiding it. The Department of Justice had issued an ultimatum. Langston had 24 hours to turn over the passwords and server locations voluntarily. If not, the FBI's cyber division would launch a federal breach protocol. They'd get the data, with or without his help. But if Langston cooperated, he might salvage a deal that could reduce his sentence by years. But Langston was stubborn. So I made a decision. "I want to speak to him," I told Hastings. There was a long pause on the line. "You're not obligated to, Sergeant." "I know, but I have something he wants, and I want to make sure he understands exactly what he took from me, and what's coming next if he doesn't cooperate." That afternoon, I was escorted to the county detention facility. Major Linwood came with me, as did Agent Morales. We were taken to a secure interview room where Langston sat behind a steel table in an orange jumpsuit. His hair was a mess, face unshaven. The smugness was gone, replaced by a hollow defiance. He looked at me and forced a smirk. "Come to gloat." "No," I said, pulling out a photograph. It was my father's military funeral, the folded flag, the honor guard, the look in my eyes as I accepted that flag. "I came to remind you of the kind of man you stole from." Langston's smirk faded. "You didn't just rent out my house," I continued. "You violated my trust, my privacy, and my family's legacy. You used my service as a loophole, thinking I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't come back. But I did." He didn't respond. "You've got 24 hours, Linwood added coldly. "Turn over the servers and you might avoid dying behind bars." Morales slid a pen and paper across the table. "Coordinates, passwords, or we come in by force." Langston's eyes flicked to the items on the table. His jaw worked like he was chewing on a rock. Then, finally, he leaned forward. "If I give it up, I want something." Linwood stepped in. "You're in no position to negotiate." But I raised a hand. "What?" "A reduced sentence. No federal time. State only." I looked at him and shook my head. "You still don't get it. You committed federal crimes against active duty military. You're lucky we're even giving you the chance to cooperate." Langston scowled, but in the end he wrote down 2 server addresses and the access keys. One was located in a rented storage unit in a nearby town. The other was a cloud server with international encryption. By nightfall, the FBI cyber team was already inside the system. The files were worse than expected. Names of over 40 property owners, many of them veterans, some deceased. Dozens of fraudulent leases, over $600,000 laundered through Clearwater and its affiliate shell companies. This was no longer a local HOA scam. This was organized real estate fraud on a national scale, and the military had just cracked it open. The next morning, Hastings called again. "We got what we needed. Langston's deal is off the table. DOJ's moving forward with maximum charges: racketeering, mail fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, unauthorized access of federal protected housing records. He's going away for a long, long time." I stepped outside and looked over my street. Flags fluttered from mailboxes. The HOA office was now closed permanently. The newly elected board had taken over with transparency and purpose. Mrs. Alder's son had returned from deployment and reclaimed his home. The Coast Guard officer's home was being restored. And mine? It was whole again. But more than that, I had something better than a court ruling or a signed settlement. I had closure. Langston had 24 hours, and I made sure every second of it counted. By the time the HOA scandal hit the local news stations, it was already trending on military forums, homeowner rights blogs, and even national media outlets. Phrases like "deployed soldiers' home stolen," "HOA corruption exposed," and "veteran triggers federal investigation" were splashed across headlines. But the real storm was still coming, because the DOJ had authorized one final round of public disclosures. A community town hall meeting, this time with cameras rolling. The event was held at the Fair Hollow Community Auditorium, a modern glass building that had once hosted barbecues and yoga classes. Now it looked more like a courtroom with folding chairs. 3 news crews set up cameras, microphones were clipped to podiums, and residents flooded in, whispering to one another, many of them carrying folders. HOA notices, old fines, rental disputes, and emails they'd once been too afraid to share. At the center of the stage sat the 3 remaining HOA board members not already arrested: Greg Matthews, Donna Reed, and Elaine Carver. Greg looked worn and haggard. Donna stared into her lap. Elaine, who had maintained her innocence from the start, looked furious, not at the crowd but at her colleagues. Major Linwood, Agent Morales, and Colonel Hastings sat in the front row. I stood just behind the podium, waiting for the signal. And then it began. The new HOA interim chairperson opened with a statement. "Today is about truth, about giving every resident of this neighborhood and every member of our armed forces who was wronged a voice." Applause erupted. Then she turned to me. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway, the floor is yours." I stepped to the podium, heart pounding but words ready. This time I didn't speak just for myself. I spoke for every silent victim of the HOA's scheme. When I was deployed overseas, I thought my biggest enemy was the one in the desert, I began. Turns out the real enemy was 3 miles from my front porch, wearing polo shirts and hiding behind homeowner bylaws. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. I came home to find strangers living in my house, my possessions missing, and the people responsible sitting here, collecting HOA dues and using them to fund a criminal enterprise. I turned and looked directly at Greg, Donna, and Elaine. "You used my home like it was yours. You sold my trust. You faked my signature. And you did it because you thought I was gone for good." Greg looked like he might vomit. Donna wiped away tears. I turned back to the crowd. But I wasn't gone, and I'm not the only one. Dozens of military families were targeted. Widows, deployed sailors, elderly homeowners. Some had no idea until this very week. Others gave up fighting and walked away. A hand went up in the crowd. It was a middle-aged man with a cane and a Vietnam vet cap. They tried to take my house after I had surgery, he said. Said I abandoned it. They fined me until I moved out. Gasps again. Another neighbor, a young mother, stood. They towed my car while I was giving birth. Said it violated parking rules. Now the cameras were locked on the board members. Major Linwood stood up. We've collected over 83 affidavits of HOA misconduct, unlawful evictions, unauthorized access to homes, fraudulent leasing. The DOJ has added more charges, and this board, what's left of it, is officially disbanded under federal oversight. Then came the hammer. Colonel Hastings took the stage with a folder in hand. I have orders from the Secretary of the Army, approved through JAG and CID. Staff Sergeant Calloway has been authorized to serve as a formal witness in upcoming federal trials against the remaining members of the fraudulent HOA network. His testimony will lead not only to local convictions, but to the review of HOA practices nationwide. Thunderous applause. And then, something unexpected. Elaine Carver stood. I didn't know, she said into the mic, her voice trembling. They kept me in the dark. I signed what they gave me and trusted them. I never took a dime. Linwood nodded. You'll have your day in court to prove that. But silence is complicity. Elaine sat down slowly. As the cameras continued to roll, I was approached by a reporter. Sergeant Calloway, any words for HOAs across the country? I looked straight into the lens. You don't own our homes. You manage them. And if you cross the line, especially with service members, you won't just face fines. You'll face the full weight of justice. The meeting ended with a standing ovation, a motion to re-elect a new board, and a new policy. Any HOA rule changes in Fair Hollow must now go through a public vote, and no home may be entered or leased without notarized, double-verified consent from the actual homeowner. That night, back on my porch, Joe handed me a cold drink. You lit the match, Marcus, he said, and burned down a whole rotten system. I looked out at the neighborhood, quieter, brighter, and finally, honest. And for the first time in months, I smiled. It was a warm spring morning when I stepped onto my newly rebuilt porch, for the first time without tension in my chest. The neighborhood was quieter now, not silent but peaceful, the kind of peace I used to long for during nights overseas. Kids rode past on bikes, dogs barked in the distance, and for the first time in months nobody was peering through their blinds or snapping photos to file an HOA complaint. Fair Hollow was healing, and so was I. The media storm had faded, but its impact hadn't. The DOJ indictments were underway in multiple states. Langston's scheme had exposed a deep vulnerability in HOA structures across the country, especially those managing properties owned by active-duty military members. The Department of Defense launched a national awareness initiative called Operation Safe Haven, helping service members document and protect their homes during deployment. And it all started because one soldier came home too early and refused to stay silent. I didn't set out to be a hero. I just wanted my house back, my memories, my dignity. But in fighting for those, I stumbled into a system built to exploit the quiet, the absent, and the trusting. That's what made it dangerous. Not just the corruption, but the silence that surrounded it. Colonel Hastings and Agent Morales called me into base one final time before closing the file. Morales handed me a thick binder labeled Case 88-921, Fair Hollow HOA federal fraud. Your testimony will finish the job, Morales said. The trials begin next month. Will they actually serve time? I asked. Langston will. Matthews will. The rest depends on what they admit to. Hastings chimed in. You did more than bring them down. You reminded this country that service doesn't end when the deployment ends. Sometimes the battlefield is right here. That hit hard. Back in Fair Hollow, a new HOA board was elected, this time by public vote. Joe was on it, along with Mrs. Alder and two veterans from the next block. Their first motion, mandate transparency. Their second, rename the community center to honor those who'd been wronged. It would now be called the Callaway Civic Hall. I objected, strongly, but the neighborhood voted unanimously. They weren't just honoring me. They were acknowledging every service member whose home had been threatened or stolen while they wore a uniform. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation to Washington, D.C. The Senate Subcommittee on Housing and Military Affairs requested my testimony, not just to close Langston's case, but to propose national reforms to protect military homeowners. When I entered that marble chamber in my dress blues, the senators fell silent. I told them about the forged leases, the missing family heirlooms, the rented homes, the fake companies, the silence from neighbors too scared to speak. And I ended with this. When we deploy, we expect to face enemies abroad, but we should never come home and find them behind a neighbor's smile or hidden in legal fine print. Our homes are not prizes to be auctioned. They are sanctuaries we've earned. 1 month later, Congress passed the Military Homeowner Protection Act, expanding service members' Civil Relief Act safeguards, mandating federal oversight of all HOA actions related to deployed personnel, and launching a national reporting hotline. Back in Fair Hollow, life went on. I planted new flowers along the walkway, rehung the photos that had been stolen, polished the flag case holding my father's colors, even got a new security system, though now it felt more symbolic than necessary. Neighbors greeted me warmly now, with gratitude, with pride. No more side glances, no more complaints. One afternoon, as I watched the sun dip below the treetops, Joe sat beside me on the porch and asked, "Do you think it's finally over?" I thought for a long moment. "Maybe not everywhere," I replied, "but here, yeah, it's over." He smiled. "You know, you didn't just take your house back. You took everyone's power back." I nodded slowly. I guess one soldier's homecoming became a nation's wake-up call. As the last light faded, I stood, saluted the flag out front, and walked inside. My house, my terms, my story, and this time, no HOA in the world could rewrite it.